vision for the future of activism, as well as my personal experience being an animal advocate, and what I see as barriers for professionals who are trying to change the system. So, for disclosures, I am the owner of Veterinary, which provides relief services for shelters and nonprofits. I am the executive director of Our Honor, which is an animal advocacy organization. We support veterinarians and animal professionals who suffer bullying and retaliation for trying to voice ethical problems. I'm also on the board of LEAP, which is Leaders for Ethics, Animals, and the Planet, and we teach kids about how to care for farmed animals through farm animal sanctuaries. I'm also a paid contributor to VMX. So I grew up in 4-H, and as an equestrian, I grew up in rural Northern California. I raised goats, chickens, and have competed in a wide variety of equestrian sports. This is an off-the-track thoroughbred named Lucy that I trained up to Prix St. George dressage, and this is us winning 4th level at the regional championships. And then I became a notorious animal rights activist whose name and face had to be smeared in a wide variety of veterinary Facebook groups. This was a meme that was created by the vigilant administrators of veterinary Facebook groups, and it says, "Beware, Dr. Heath has an agenda that doesn't mean anything positive for our profession. We recommend you block this person, Crystal Heath." So thank you all for coming today and being brave enough to watch my talk. Needless to say, discussions about animal rights are quite contentious in the veterinary profession, and these in-depth discussions are pretty much avoided. So this is maybe why. This is a slide that a student sent to me. I studied animal science at UC Davis before attending veterinary school at UC Davis. And we would periodically have that lecture about animal welfare versus animal rights. And we would see slides like this. And animal rights is very much framed as the idea that you can't be in favor of animal welfare and animal rights at the same time. These are two diametrically opposed opinions. You're either on one side or the other. You can't be both. And in fact, animal rights harms animal welfare. And animal rights activists are violent extremists who spread lies and are going to take away our food, our dogs, and our horses. But what if there's another way to look at it? This is archaeologist Stephen Milton, and he discovered that humans developed the ability to empathize with other animals around 100,000 years ago. So most people think of vegans and animal rights as a fairly contemporary phenomenon, brought about by a bunch of uninformed city folks. But who were, in fact, the first animal rights activists? I'm not saying these cave people were, but we know that ancient humans did care for people who were handicapped, and at some point they might have cared for animals of other species too. And we know about their empathy for other animals through fossil records and their ability to hunt. We kind of conclude that this probably came about from their ability to predict the patterns of other animals and their movements. So our ability to empathize with other animals made us really strategic hunters, but we were hunters with emotional baggage. And we know this isn't a strange idea because other species of animals empathize with each other. We know mice grimace when their friends are in pain, and rats work to free trapped cage mates. Hens become distressed when their chicks are in discomfort. But unlike these animals, no other animal has the ability to use our empathy to remedy the suffering of other animals. The human ability to remedy suffering is unparalleled in all of the animal species. We can fix bodies with surgery, relieve pain with medications, and stop infections with antibiotics. Abilities that set us apart from the rest of the animal kingdom. But our ability to inflict suffering is also unparalleled. Cultures and religions throughout the world have long embraced compassion for other animals. Jainism, Hinduism, Buddhism teach ahimsa, which is the ethical principle of not causing harm to living beings. The earliest reference to nonviolence against other animals was around 1500 BCE. But even in the West, the animal rights movement is nothing new. It was once so successful, in fact, that it led Irish playwright, Nobel laureate George Bernard Shaw to write, "I'm beginning to be astonished at the difficulty I now have in finding anybody who eats meat." Annie Besant, a British socialist, women's rights activist, and advocate for India's self-rule, who was one of the women who inspired Gandhi, wrote, "The food reform movement has outlived its period of ridicule. It is entering on a period of recognition among all thoughtful and intelligent people." And the food reform movement was part of this broader humanitarian wave at the time. Vegetarians were involved in other movements, such as slavery abolition and women's suffrage, and this led suffragist Maud Joachim, who herself was jailed several times for her activism, to write, "It's a strange fact that the ranks of the militant suffragettes are mostly recruited from the mild vegetarians, and the authorities in prison have allowed us a special vegetarian diet." The reformist wave also brought about the founding of the RSPCA. Veterinarian William Youatt was one of its members, and he wrote the book The Obligation and Extent of Humanity to Brutes in 1839. And he said, "Although less intelligent and not immortal, they are susceptible of pain, but because they cannot remonstrate nor associate with their fellows in defense of their rights, our best theologians and philosophers have not condescended to plead their cause, or even to make mention of them, although, as just asserted, they have as much right to protection as the best of their masters have." But it would be another 148 years until the American Veterinary Medical Association formally recognized the importance of animal pain and its management. And to this day, they still do not call for analgesia during castration of pigs less than 14 days of age, although the vast majority of piglets are castrated in the US at less than 3 days of age. Leo Tolstoy's extensive writing on the topic of slaughterhouses is often summed up in this apocryphal quote, "As long as there are slaughterhouses, there will always be battlefields." But perhaps the reverse is true. Before World War I, the Russian Empire was home to a vibrant vegetarian community. A Kiev Vegetarian Society canteen was one of about a dozen in the city and served more than 200,000 visitors in 1911. And Jews made up the largest group, 37.4%, according to a 1912 survey. But by the end of World War II, the Holocaust had decimated their population. And during World War I, European farmers became soldiers and American farmers were called to feed the Allied forces. And in a 1917 meat industry trade journal foreshadowed the coming intensification of US agriculture. They wrote, "The stern necessity of war has created an undreamed of efficiency that will last long after the war. As a nation, we must compete with that efficiency if we are going to hold any share of trade in the world." And this set the stage for the intensification of modern industrial animal agriculture. I've attended several talks about climate change and sustainability at various veterinary conferences, and the common theme always emerges in those talks. As a nation grows wealthier, the demand for meat increases, so veterinarians have a duty to ensure a safe and plentiful supply of animal protein to meet this demand. But is demand for meat really driven by the people? Or is demand driven by corporations? As a nation's wealth increases, their demand for gambling, alcohol, and luxury goods also increases. These aren't some innate human need. And this pork industry webinar shedded some light on just how the pork industry works to increase consumption of their products. Mohan Sahani of Northwestern University is an expert in business innovation and modern marketing, and he said, if you build a habit, something they do day in and day out, you've got a great business. Google is a toothbrush, Facebook is a toothbrush. We've got to make pork into a toothbrush, not something that's exotic that you do occasionally. Last year, we obtained public records via a Freedom of Information Act request from the USDA Agriculture Marketing Service about an $8 million university-based national pork board program to enhance consumer trust in the pork industry. And Vox covered our research in this article if you want to check it out. And there's the Chicken Marketing Summit. Last year, they discussed how to bridge the trust gap with Gen Z consumers, among other topics. And this year, we expect to see more on how they're going to use artificial intelligence in marketing. And of course, the many celebrity endorsements. But where are the celebrity endorsements for beans and tofu? Why isn't there much interest by the soy and bean industry to get people to consume their products instead of animal-based protein? Well, according to the American Soybean Association, 90% of U.S. soybeans go to animal feed. It's more profitable for commodity companies to sell their products as animal feed than it is to feed humans directly. This allows them to expand their markets. Ariel Ron, who's a historian, put it best in this article and wrote, "The astonishing profusion of commodity crop production requiring finding new ways to upsell calories for an affluent consumer society. Meat was the economic solution to the historically unprecedented problem of large structural caloric surpluses." So what are the effects of this structure of financial incentives? Now, 60% of the biomass on Earth is farmed animals, only 4% are wild animals. Of birds, 70% are farmed poultry, only 30% are wild birds, and we have lost 83% of our wild mammals and 50% of our plant species. In the 1500s, we had 30 to 60 million bison roaming the North American plains. After they were killed off by European settlers, their numbers dropped to only 325. But today, there are 500,000 bison, but 87.2 million domestic cows in the U.S. But some say cows are the solution to climate change. Frank Mittloner points out in his talk that the conversion of biogas to RNG is considered the most negative fuel type there is, and the state incentivizes, the state of California incentivizes this like nothing else. $200 per ton of CO2e. The dairies who do this make more money through those so-called low-carbon fuel standard credits than they make with their milk checks. And so we saw this growth of these large dairies that received grants from the California Department of Food and Agriculture to put in these dairy digesters to capture this methane. These dairies are situated in what used to be Tulare Lake or Lake Pahashi. This is home of the Tachi Yucca tribe. The Tachi were the largest tribe in California. Lake Pahashi was the largest freshwater lake west of the Mississippi. Historically, it was 512,000 acres or 800 square miles across. But agriculture diverted the water and decimated the food supply for the Tachi and the wild animals. But in 2023, flooding returned water to the lake. And the effects were devastating. This is an aerial shot of the flooding. It caused an estimated $20 billion in losses for the dairy industry, which was California's #1 agriculture industry. And this area is also the epicenter of the H5N1 outbreak in California dairies this year. Other bodies of water are also being affected by our current methods of protein production. The Colorado River is in peril. 79% of its flow goes to agriculture, but the vast majority of that agriculture is livestock feed. We have also increased our corn and soy acreage, and that acreage we need to water as well. And now, in order to feed that growing number of animals that are now being used in animal-based protein production. And we say, oh, it's these animal rights activists and these vegans are wanting to limit our food choices, take away our ability to eat what we want. But who is actually taking away our food choices? Lawmakers are preventing animal-free methods of protein production from competing with animal-based methods. Cultivated meat has been banned in Florida and Alabama, and other states are considering banning it as well, including Nebraska. Nebraska Governor Jim Pillen is a veterinarian and a hog producer and has received millions of dollars in government subsidies for his hog operation. And a few weeks ago, the AVMA Veterinary Leadership Conference, the House of Delegates rejected a resolution to support cultivated meat, with some members saying supporting such a resolution would be criminal to adopt, as it would imply that what we do now to animals is unethical and not welfare-oriented. We can now make cow's milk without cows using precision fermentation, so why not incentivize this method of protein production? Why is this not being given to kids in McDonald's Happy Meals? This is a method which bacteria produces the whey protein, and it's the same method that we now use to create insulin. And according to some estimates, using precision fermentation, we can produce enough protein to feed the world using an area the size of London. Right now, 19 out of 20 Americans are found to not consume the recommended amount of fiber each day. High fiber consumers have reduced incidence of colorectal cancer, breast cancer, stroke, esophageal cancer, cardiovascular disease, and type 2 diabetes, lower risk of mortality from cancer, heart disease as well, and all-cause mortality as well. And it's like, why are you bringing up human nutrition? This is a veterinary conference. I am just bringing this up because this is a slide that was presented by a member of the pork board at a veterinary conferences touting the nutrition benefits of pork consumption for human beings. But this slide fails to acknowledge how pork is deficient in fiber, which is the nutrient that most Americans are lacking. So is there anyone pushing back against the power, growth, and expansion of modern industrial animal agriculture? In 1970, the animal rights movement was reconstituted with the publication of Peter Singer's renowned book, Animal Liberation. But instead of focusing on the production side of things, they primarily focused on consumer demand, which was not very strategic. It became easy for those in power to dismiss criticisms of the industry as vegans trying to take away our food choices. And this framing by activists further entrenched the product status of animals and made our ongoing denial of animal rights a consumer choice issue. Corporate interests love it when we frame things as a consumer choice issue. They want to keep it that way. This is what the fossil fuel companies did. If you wanted to address fossil fuels, people should then buy fuel-efficient cars. It wasn't until we mandated fuel efficiency standards in the state that we were able to address the fossil fuel crisis. The industry understood what activists did not. Their profits should not be left to the whims of consumer demand. And today, animal-based protein production is highly subsidized, from feed profit insurance to grants to build more slaughterhouses to the National School Lunch Program. This is a 2015 study prepared for the dairy farmers of Canada, and it explains how 73% of dairy revenue in the US comes from some form of subsidy. So PETA is a lightning rod for criticism of animal rights activists, but the animal rights movement is not a monolith. PETA does not represent the perspectives of all animal rights activists. But before disparaging PETA, we have to remember that many of our veterinary colleagues work for PETA, and they have made great strides in advancing animal protection through their work. They have gotten many companies to stop testing on animals, stop using fur, and it influenced numerous industry practices. PETA successfully got Budweiser to stop docking their horses' tails. It was not the American Association of Equine Practitioners who did that. And Chimp Crazy, of course, I don't know if you saw that, but Jared Goodman and Brittany Peete worked tirelessly to save the chimps kept in captivity by Tony Haddix. And they do great work for other captive animal advocacy as well. But many of us disagree with PETA's framing sometimes too. So remember this slide from the beginning. How do you think it makes our colleagues feel who do work in animal protection? Is this turning away many students from potentially really rewarding careers in animal rights advocacy? And just saying how we misinform the public, use violence and stunts in order to receive donations. And as far as saying animal rights activists are completely against these things, this is inaccurate. Many animal rights activists do think that we can have relationships with dogs and cats and think that riding horses isn't that bad. So it's a spectrum of things that are worth discussing. Ethics and philosophy aside, going against our nature and killing for 8 hours a day, as slaughterhouse workers do, it wears on us. And slaughterhouse workers suffer from high rates of injuries and also psychological distress, perpetration-induced traumatic stress, and this leads to dependency on alcohol, drugs, and domestic violence. But what if we could completely automate a slaughterhouse and no human has to be involved in the killing process? Well, we're still having the issue of increasing diseases. We are seeing an increase in infectious diseases because of our interactions with other animals. And this article really explains the infectious disease trap of animal agriculture. And you have to problem, as we increase our demand for meat, we have to deforest areas, and that increases the human interaction with wild animals. So this increases zoonotic disease events. But even if we wanted to conserve forests, that leads to greater intensification, and you have animals in packed spaces, genetically similar animals, packed into small areas of land in close contact with humans, which also increases the risk of zoonotic disease events. So even if we were to try to save the forest, that also leads to this problem of increased zoonotic diseases just because of the numbers of animals that we are confining and feeding. And many researchers have been concerned about this, and this study actually found that if we shift away from animal-based protein production, we would save $7.3 trillion per year in production-related health burdens and ecosystem degradation. And recent work out of the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, led by Dr. Aaron Bernstein, shows that by addressing the causes of infectious disease outbreaks, we can not only save billions of dollars, but lives as well. And they say high-density livestock operations can serve as an opportune environment for spillover from wild animals into livestock, or as incubators for pandemic influenza strains. Large pig and poultry farms are where the genetic reassortment needed to source pandemic influenza strains would most likely occur. So who has the power to influence policy and legislation related to animal agriculture, intensification and expansion? Well, we do. We are highly influential when it comes to advocating for policies related to animals. We are the trusted experts. We give the industry the social license to operate. But are those who are advocating on our behalf representative of the beliefs of the majority of veterinarians, or are they representing corporate interests? This is a chart that I received via FOIA request from the pork board, and it shows the current state of corporate consolidation in the pork industry. The vast majority of pork processing is done by just 4 companies: Smithfield, JBS, Tyson, Seaboard. Can veterinarians speak out against and criticize the practices used by these big 4? Well, it seems the AVMA isn't one to push back against these big 4. Last year, the AVMA wrote a letter supporting specifically Section 12007 of the Farm Bill, which would overturn Prop 12. And if you weren't aware, Prop 12 is a bill passed by 63% of California voters, which demanded that some pork sold in California must come from pigs whose mothers were kept in pens with at least 24 square feet of space, which would take them out of gestation crates. Does this position align with the majority of veterinarians? Unfortunately, there's not a ton of data about veterinarians' views on Prop 12 specifically, but according to a survey performed by Farm Sanctuary in 2004, which was sent to more than 70,000 veterinarians, of which more than 1,200 responded, the vast majority, 72%, found gestation crates very objectionable. And the AVMA has a long track record of siding with mainstream corporate practices, even when the vast majority of veterinarians oppose these practices. In 2002, for the 4th time, the AVMA rejected a resolution presented by the Association of Veterinarians for Animal Rights that called for a position against induced or forced molting by food deprivation. Farm Sanctuary survey shows that the vast majority of veterinarians, 61% found forced molting very objectionable, 18% found it objectionable. And this is United Poultry Concerns protesting the AVMA back in 1992. And the AVMA ended up adopting a resolution on induced molting that was submitted by the Association of Avian Pathologists and the Association of Avian Veterinarians rather than the one submitted by AVAR. And the new position allows for reduced lighting and restricted diet, but not withholding water. They recommended intermittent feeding or low-density diets rather than complete food restrictions. So AVAR did not get its way, but it did inspire at least some change and some thinking on practice. And that brings us to ventilation shutdown, which many of you were here for the talks before about ventilation shutdown. In 2020, footage was released by activists of pigs being exterminated using ventilation shutdown, plus during the COVID-19 induced slaughterhouse bottleneck. Jen Sorensen, who was a spokesperson for I Have Select Farms, assuaged public concern and said veterinarians and animal production well-being professionals are overseeing the process to ensure accordance with the American Association of Swine Veterinarians and the American Veterinary Medical Association. Many of us were outraged that our profession was being used to lend legitimacy to this practice. So we founded Veterinarians Against Ventilation Shutdown, and now more than 2,000 veterinarians have signed on. How did ventilation shutdown come to be legitimized in the first place? It was due to a $100,000 industry-funded grant given to North Carolina State University Prestige Department of Poultry Science, which was then used to give the scientific justification for VSD going into the AVMA's guidelines for depopulation of animals. Then, when depopulation methods are used, producers receive bailouts for the losses in the form of USDA indemnity payments, because the AVMA guidelines for the depopulation of animals were created as part of a cooperative agreement with the USDA to set policy and indemnity payments related to animal depopulation. So how much money are we talking about? We collected data about the bailout recipients, and the payment data is publicly available at usaspending.gov. We received depopulation methods used at each depopulation through a Freedom of Information Act request of USDA APHIS, and then we were able to match the payment data with the depopulation events to figure out which companies used which depopulation methods. The biggest bailout recipient is Jennie-O Turkey Store, and they received $107 million. Herbert's Poultry Ranch came in second with $89 million, and Cal-Maine Foods came in third with $44 million. And you'll notice all of the top bailout recipients, in fact, the top 15 all used ventilation shutdown to kill their animals. Does allowing bailouts and legitimizing VSD actually lower the price of food or keep the price of food low? Cal-Maine Foods stock price has more than doubled over the past year, and their quarterly sales have skyrocketed 718%. Their CEO salary is over $1 million per year, which honestly isn't that great for a CEO. Tyson CEO makes $13 million. Hormel CEO makes more than $6 million, but their average worker makes $47,000 a year. We have a blog that details the revenue of many of the CEO salaries and these companies that all used VSD. So allowing VSD doesn't actually lower the cost of food, it just allows these corporations to not put plans in place to use less cruel methods. They have the resources to do this, and because avian influenza has been like a known threat since 2004, but they have failed to address this issue. I know when I grew up in 4-H, we were taught we had a responsibility. When you have an animal, you have to ensure that we provide them veterinary care, food, water, and quick and painless death. But it seems modern, intensive animal agriculture does not have the responsibility to do that. Our research was featured in this story that appeared on the front page of the New York Times back in April. One AVMA leader said on a public forum in response to my post about VSD, Mass poultry depopulation by ventilation shutdown in combination with a secondary method is considered humane and fully supported by hundreds of veterinarians who worked on this reference committee. But a recent poll of 3,059 veterinarians on the Veterinary Information Network showed only 1.1% believe that VSD plus is both an ethical and humane method of depopulation. 23.5% believe it is neither ethical or humane, but may sometimes be necessary, and 42.2% believe it is neither ethical nor humane and don't believe that there is ever any valid reason for its use. When veterinarians first sent this petition to the AVMA House of Delegates back in 2020, asking them to reclassify ventilation shutdown, the House of Delegates voted to put the question back to the panel on depopulation to decide. House of Delegates member Dr. Michael Zager is quoted in the media as saying, "We have African swine fever in the Dominican Republic, there's avian influenza, there are going to be times when this is needed, like it or not." But this statement deflects from the real issue, which is the fact that producers failed to plan to use less cruel methods, and since they receive bailouts for its use, there is no incentive to put plans in place to use less cruel methods. More than a year went by and we saw no change. VSD was now widely being used again to depopulate poultry flocks in this avian influenza outbreak. Veterinarians then submitted another petition in the interim while they were reviewing the guidelines for the depopulation. We asked them to again consider reclassifying heat stroke in the interim as not recommended. This petition was then not allowed to be heard at the next meeting. And then they actually changed the House of Delegates manual to say the House Advisory Committee may determine that a proposed resolution is out of order if the resolution is substantially similar to one previously presented by the House of Delegates, or if the resolution is outside the authority of the House of Delegates. In such a case, the proposed resolution will not be presented to the House of Delegates. Why did they do this? One theory is that they realized they had shaky grounds for denying our petition, so they decided to codify it in the manual, once again, just moving the goalposts. Some House of Delegates members I spoke to were not even aware of this change. So, can you go through normal channels to address these issues? What happens to veterinarians who push back against the most powerful and invasive industry on the planet? I've heard stories from numerous veterinarians, those that don't even consider themselves animal rights activists. They're just research vets, production vets, zoo vets trying to make their industry better and improve the welfare of animals in their care. And their stories are heartbreaking. Many do not want their story shared publicly, so I'll just share my own story. So during the COVID-19 induced slaughterhouse bottleneck, I was kind of thrust into the public sphere about all of this. I had voiced concerns about modern intensive animal protein production practices, terminal surgeries, and all these things. And my colleagues told me I really should shadow livestock veterinarians so I know what I'm talking about. And I grew up in 4-H. I studied animal science at UC Davis before going to vet school. I think I know what I'm talking about, but I also recognize that I don't work in animal production. So I posted on the veterinary Facebook group that I was looking to shadow a livestock vet. And then it was like kind of this perfect storm. It was COVID, it was like the industry was already on edge, and this pile-on ensued that like I did not expect at all. This meme went out about me. I was banned from veterinary Facebook groups, and it was like scary. My colleagues were sending me all, like I was banned, but then my colleagues were sending me screenshots of the things that people were saying about me. And I can like look at it and laugh like right now, but it was quite frightening at the time, and it's just so frustrating to like not be able to set the record straight in these groups because I was banned and blocked and couldn't tell my own story about what I meant and all of these things. So then a few months later, we got this email via a FOIA request from the USDA Agriculture Marketing Service. This is an email from the Animal Ag Alliance, basically showing how they fanned the flames of this whole thing. But even 3 years later, I'm still feeling the effects of all of this. Me and half a dozen other veterinarians were barred from attending the AVMA's Cargill-sponsored Humane Ending Symposium. This story appeared on VIN News, and when the reporter Jennifer Fiala asked AVMA leadership why we were barred, they basically implied that because other anti-BSD activists had staged protests that our presence posed some sort of threat. And they said that they don't want anything to hinder the ability to share information. We can't have people afraid to provide information because they're afraid they'll be publicly targeted. And we have not publicly targeted anyone, but I have been publicly targeted and lost opportunities because of my position and my advocacy. And I have many colleagues have reached out to me telling me what the AVMA has said. Somebody who went to one of the APOC conferences told me that one of the AVMA leaders saw my name. I was viewing it remotely and said, that's Crystal Heath, she's a dangerous animal extremist, be careful what she says. Said something about me diverting animal bodies for my own purpose. I don't know what they meant. And then I asked very normal questions, and people were like, what? Anyway, so I was also barred from the AVMA legislative line, and they sent me this email saying the issues we'll be talking about include legislation such as the Healthy Dog Importation Act, and participants in the line will be focused on these particular issues versus the issues you care so passionately about. I actually care about the Healthy Dog Importation Act, so that was and I also was recently barred from speaking at the SAGMA Symposium. My talk was not even activism related. Before all of this, I was known as the how to pay off your debt person and how to get paid what you're worth person. So my talk was paying off student debt quickly so you can follow your passion. They had accepted my talk back in September, and we also had a table for my nonprofit, Our Honor. And I got this email saying, basically, part of what SAGMA considers when selecting participants for its symposium is each participant's policy positions and prior conduct at similar events. Unfortunately, your prior actions at AVMA events and the policy positions of Our Honor raise concerns regarding participation at SAGMA Symposium. When I asked them to clarify what they meant by policies, activities, and conduct, they replied by saying, the feedback received, including your activities at other AVMA events of which you are already aware of, supported the decision to decline your participation in SAGMA Symposium 2025. The decision hasn't been made and will not be subject to further discussion. And I wanted to ask them, like, what would you do if you were in my position? I still have no idea what activities they're referring to. But it seems like I'm being character assassinated and there's some sort of false narrative being perpetuated about me. So all that aside, what can you do? Well, the AVMA members have until January 30th to comment on the guidance for the depopulation of animals. Right now, BSD is listed as a Tier 3 method for pigs and a Tier 2 method for poultry birds. Those tiers were gone over before, but Tier 1 are the least cruel methods. Tier 3 are methods basically you should only use if doing nothing would result in worse suffering. So there's this letter on the BAFA's page you can go to and read their letter. That's going to be sent to the AVMA, so definitely check that out. But I also read the draft of the guidelines and make comments for yourself too. So I found this book, The Occasional Human Sacrifice by Carl Elliott, really illuminating. And it's about whistleblowers in modern human experimentation, from the Tuskegee syphilis studies to the unethical Cincinnati Medical Center radiation studies that were performed in the 60s to really grisly tracheal transplant surgeries performed at the Karolinska in 2008. And Elliott found that the more difficult it is to get into an organization, the higher degree of self-deception there will be within the organization. When members pay a high price, a high entrance fee, literally or metaphorically, they have a higher stake in proving that they made a good decision to join. The members of elite organizations are loyal. They defend the organization to others. And I can't help but think that this is the veterinary profession. We often fall into this trap. So many students have told me, I've already invested $200,000 into my education. I am not going to ruin it. I'm not going to risk anything. I'm not going to risk my career by speaking out. But we have to acknowledge, like, even in human medicine and even in human experimentation, they still have problems, and their patients have rights and protections. Our patients have none. So what is the answer? Psychologist Jennifer Freed has proposed that what can keep institutions from committing these acts of betrayal upon those who serve and are served by the institution is through institutional courage. And this is when institutions put systems in place to protect whistleblowers, apologize for wrongdoing, repair the damage done, and put structures in place to make sure it never happens again. But just how does change happen? I think most veterinarians assume that change happens gradually and over time, but history has shown us that that's not always the case. In fact, it would seem while we wait for incremental change and incremental welfare reforms, things have gotten so much worse for animals. Ventilation shutdown was something never considered before. We now use gas chambers to kill pigs in slaughterhouses when we never used to do that before. Maybe we can take some inspiration from the suffragettes, modern day activists like ACT UP. ACT UP stands for the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, which was a grassroots activist group founded in 1987 to fight for the rights, healthcare, and dignity of people living with AIDS. They combated the stigma around people with AIDS, pressured the FDA to speed up the approval process for life-saving drugs for people with AIDS, advocating for programs enabling patients with life-threatening illnesses to access experimental drugs outside of clinical trials. Their artistic demonstrations and press inspired bold change for people with AIDS. What if veterinarians joined together with activist groups to protect animals and public health? What could we accomplish? So this is just one example of a student project done a few years ago. And it just kind of is an example of how right now we are teaching young, enthusiastic, bright-eyed students macabre workarounds for corporations so that they can continue profiting from these methods of intensive animal-based protein production. Sometimes we get so focused on the problem for us that we fail to ask ourselves if it's even a problem that needs to exist in the first place. We do have examples of bold change in veterinary medicine. In the past, high-quality, high-volume spay-neuter veterinarians were vilified and viewed as devaluing the profession by providing these low-cost services. But as shelter medicine became more professionalized and animal lovers created more rescues and spay-neuter centers across the U.S., shelter euthanasia rates plummeted from 13.5 million dogs and cats euthanized every year in the 1970s to less than 1 million now. Dr. Andrew Knight, Brittany Hammack-McCurry, Dr. Tristan Rosenberg are depicted here, and they're examples of veterinarians who were conscientious objectors to terminal procedures in their veterinary schools. They implemented more ethical models that prioritized the use of models, build bodies, and access to care in which students learn procedures on animals who need it under the guidance of experienced surgeons. Sadly, to this day, most veterinary schools still use terminal procedures, but at least human medical students no longer practice procedures on animals in medical schools. Some residents still do, though, unfortunately. Hopefully, veterinary schools will soon follow these human medical schools in advocating for more ethical teaching methods. This is Dr. Pat Bassoud, former chief veterinarian of the Food Safety and Inspection Service, and he's quoted as saying in the New York Times, "When it comes to power, no one dares stand up to the pork industry, not even the US government." But shouldn't veterinarians dare stand up to the pork industry? Some vets are. This is Dr. Alice Broth, a former pig veterinarian turned animal activist who is bravely sharing her story about what it's really like working in the pig industry. She faced backlash from the Royal Veterinary Society, who threatened to revoke her license for sharing her story, but fortunately she won the battle. And this is at the AVMA House of Delegates meeting back in July 2023. in Denver, Colorado. The topic of sustainability came up, and Dr. Martha Smith Blackmore said this: the elephant in the room is the impact that intensive animal agriculture has on our environment. And Dr. Martha Smith Blackmore bravely posed for a photo with peaceful activists at the AVMA Veterinary Leadership Conference and posted this on her Twitter. And hopefully more vets will join her in the future. So the triangle is the historic model of the veterinary profession, with man on top, the women underneath, and other animals ranked below that in order of our moral concern for them. But One Health teaches us that all life is interconnected. If we do something that harms one species, all of us suffer. So should the veterinary profession see to it that the interests of all species are protected? How do we push back against these corporate interests? I think we should start to question authority. Let's empower and support our colleagues who are working for change and stop bullying and retaliation, even when we disagree with those who are being bullied and retaliated against. The AVMA still has a lot of power, so I think we should all stay members and stay active and join committees and be that dissenting voice. We shouldn't be afraid to speak to the media. The media loves vets and is craving diverse opinions on these things. But the AVMA and the industry want consistent messaging around these topics and around depopulation. So let's make sure that the message coming from vets is anything but consistent. Let's challenge people to make up their own minds and not allow those in power to speak for us. So if you want to dive deeper into this, you can check out my recent article in Vox, and I cover a lot of this information I spoke about here, as well as my theory of change. And this is an article I published in Time magazine with Jean Bauer about avian influenza, so check that out too. And if you want to check out our recent press, we were featured in the media 87 times last year. And feel free to email me if you have any questions, but I'm also happy to answer any questions here, although I'm very hard of hearing, so. Any questions?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Just thank you for existing.
Oh, thank you. Anyone else? Do you want to ask if my jacket is leather?
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. I have witnessed some of the attacks on you and veterinarians that do believe in animal rights advocacy, animal welfare advocacy, speaking out. And it seems like there's such an ingrained, reflexive, visceral, response. Would you be able to speak on where that comes from and maybe how we can bridge this reflexive gap?
Yeah, and I think it's honestly, I mean, animal rights activists are criticized all the time, but there's some criticism that needs to be talked about, and that is the personal attacks that I've seen against my colleagues by animal rights activists who, even my colleagues who are working on things like high expansion nitrogen foam. I'm in favor of it. I've shared that sort of stuff in their research on my own social media, only to have my animal rights followers attack them and say no, you guys, don't put their on our, please. And they've told me they've gotten death threats from animal rights activists, which, that's one thing I'm just educating animal rights activists about. For one thing, if you're a real animal rights activist, you shouldn't be